Hi guys, tonight we're going to go over sustainability. And let me get my PowerPoint back to where it needs to be. Okay, so first of all, we have resources. And we have two types of resources. So we have renewable and non-renewable resources. And renewable resources are those resources produced in nature that are produced more rapidly than they can be consumed by humans. And the non-renewable resources are those that are produced in nature more slowly than they can be consumed by humans. So they're being used up. So geographers observe two major misuses of these resources. The first is depleting non-renewable resources. So humans are using up these resources that can't be created by nature as fast as we are using them. That makes sense. Then the next problem is that we have renewable resources that nature should be able to make in time for us to use them. However, these renewable resources are being destroyed through pollution of air, water, and soil. So whereas nature should be able to create enough air, water, and soil for the amount of people that exist on the earth, because of things people are doing through pollution, these renewable resources are also being destroyed. Okay, so there are three pillars of sustainability. The first pillar is the environment pillar. This is sustainable development that can only exist if conservation is embraced more fully than wasting resources or preservation of all resources. So preservation is staying kind of at the status quo, staying right where you are right now. And conservation is doing better than staying where you are. So the environment pillar says that we need to do better. We need to embrace not wasting resources. The next pillar is the economy pillar. This is efforts to set prices of commodities and goods based not on supply and demand, but also on cost to the environment. So most of you guys have probably had, if you haven't had AP Econ, then you've had maybe some basic Econ in ninth grade. So you know that supply and demand says the more expensive something is, the more scarce something is, the more expensive it's going to be. So for example, let's say when iPhone 6s first came out, they were very, very expensive, because there weren't very many of them. Whereas iPhone 4 right now, lots and lots of them are out there, so they're not so expensive. They're quite cheap. Well, the economy pillar says that in addition to worrying about that supply and demand, we also need to worry about the cost to the environment. So not only are we thinking about how scarce something is, but how much it's hurting the environment. So it's not just about how many, like, let's say, Honda Accords there are, but how much damage is that Honda Accord? How much pollution is it putting into the air as it sits on the road, just puffing out into the air. And then the third pillar is the society pillar. This is modifying the wants of culture in regard to shelter, food, and clothing to objects that are sustainable. So this is saying, like, your house, people need to start thinking about making their houses out of sustainable resources. People need to start eating things that are sustainable. Like, people are starting to think about eating food that is sustainable, fish that is sustainable, and people need to start thinking about clothing that is made out of sustainable fabrics. So these are things that are for example, when farmers grow this food, when farmers grow these crops, when farmers raise these animals, they're thinking about raising enough and then planting those crops again to make sure that there's always enough for the next crop and the next generation. The same with the things they're building houses out of, and then the same with the things they're making fabrics out of. Okay, so the Earth has two physical systems. We have we have four interrelated systems, but they're broken down into two big groups: the non-living and the living. So the non-living are the abiotic. So these are non-living or inorganic matter. And the inorganic are broken down into three. And we have the atmosphere, which is the thin layer of gas surrounding the Earth. And the atmosphere has to do with, where the climate happens. And the climate is broken down into tropical climates, dry climates, warm mid-latitude climates, cold mid-latitude climates, and polar climates. And then we have the hydrosphere. This is all water on or near the Earth's surface. And then we have the lithosphere, which is the Earth's crust and the layer just below the crust. And then we have the biotic system. So these are everything, all the living organisms. So the biosphere is all living organisms on Earth. So the lithosphere is where most plants and animals live and where they obtain food and shelter. The hydrosphere provides water to drink and physical support for aquatic life. The atmosphere provides the air for animals to breathe and protects them from the sun's rays. So people are now the most important agents of change on Earth, which is not something, I guess, species-centric as much as to say that people are making the largest changes and are doing the most damage. Human modifications of the abiotic system has ongoing ramifications. For example, the atmosphere now contains pollutants. Humans have trouble breathing because of these pollutants. Without water, humans would waste away and die. Excessive extraction of resources from the lithosphere limits the availability of materials for building and fuel for energy. And excessive erosion or depletion of nutrients limits the biosphere's ability to provide food for humans and food for animals as well. Now, erosion occurs when the soil washes away in the rain or blows away in the wind. Farmers contribute to erosion through inappropriate choices. To reduce erosion, farmers can avoid steep slopes, plow less, and plant crops whose roots help bind the soil. And let's go back up to depletion of nutrients. Soil contains the nutrients necessary for successful growth of plants, including those useful to humans. Nutrients are depleted when plants withdraw more nutrients than natural processes can replace. Each type of plant withdraws certain nutrients from the soil and restores them. To minimize depletion, farmers can plant different crops from one year to the next so that the land remains productive over the long term. So that whole crop rotation thing, it really is important and it really works, and it's really necessary for making sure that the nutrients stay in the soil and that we're getting all the nutrients that we need in our food. Okay, so let's talk about, hold on just one second. Okay, I want to talk about a couple more definitions before we move on. So, a couple definitions. A geographer named Alexander von Humboldt and another geographer named Carl Ritter came up with an approach called environmental determinism. Environmental determinism says that the physical environment causes social development. So they believe that the laws from the natural sciences should be used to understand relationships between the physical environment and human actions. That they urge human geographers to adopt the methods of scientific inquiry used by natural scientists. Let's see. Okay, and then the other type of geography is possibilism. And this says the physical environment may limit some human actions, but people have the ability to adjust to their environment. That people can choose a course of action from many alternatives in the physical environment. So, for example, the climate of any location influences human activities, especially food production. From one generation to the next, people learn The different food crops thrive in different climates. Rice requires plentiful water. So, for example, rice grows really well in places like Vietnam, whereas wheat survives on limited moisture and actually grows poorly in very wet environments. On the other hand, wheat is more likely than rice to grow successful in colder climates. So, under this theory of possibilism, people can choose the crops they grow and yet be compatible with their environment. Okay, let us see. Okay, so modifying the environment. So we have two really great examples of modifying the environment. And the first is in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands has two types of, I guess, modifications that they have done. And the first are called polders. The polder is a piece of land that's created by draining water from an area. And polders were first used in the 13th century, and they were first used by private developers in the 16th and 17th century, and then by the government in the past 200 years. And Netherlands has 6,500 square kilometers of polders, and they make up 16% of the country's land area. And they're mainly used for agriculture because the Netherlands does not want to be dependent on imported food, which is very smart. Some of the polders are used for housing, and then there's one polder that makes up Europe's busiest airport. So the second really distinctive modification that they have in the Netherlands are dikes. And dikes are kind of like huge dams. And there are dikes in the north and in the south of the Netherlands. And these dikes are used because of the North Sea. And the North Sea is kind of like an arm off of the Atlantic Ocean. And these dikes are used to protect the Netherlands from flooding in the north and in the south. And in the north, they're protected from something called the Zuiderzee, which is fun to say. And in the south, they're protected under something called the Delta Plan. So there's been some concern since these modifications were made, and attitudes have changed in the Netherlands about modifying the land. And so the Dutch have started breaking down some of the dikes, and in 1990 they started returning some of the land into wetlands, and there's been concern that they use too many insecticides and fertilizers on their farms, and that's contaminated their drinking water, causing acid rain and other environmental problems. So they're trying to stop doing so much modification of their environment. So because of that, the Dutch have become world leaders in reducing the causes of global warming by acting to reduce industrial pollution and increase polar and wind power use, which is pretty cool. So the other place that people have done a lot of modifying in the environment is in Florida. And in Florida, unsustainable modifications made to the ecosystem as a result of draining portions of the Everglades, and they've had water pollution from cattle grazing. So in Florida, the wetlands between Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades National Park and the Kissimmee River between Lake Kissimmee and Lake Okeechobee are sensitive environmental areas. And so these lowlands were modified, but in a way less so than in the Netherlands. The Everglades were once very wide, they were shallow and fresh water, and they flowed from Lake Okeechobee to the Gulf of Mexico. They had a very sensitive ecosystem of plants and animals because it's a really distinctive landscape there. But because of because of human actions, a lot has been destroyed. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a levee around Lake Okeechobee in the 1930s. And they actually drained the northern 1/3 of the Everglades during the 1940s, which diverted the Kissimmee River into canals. They also constructed dikes and levees near Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and the southern portion of the Everglades became a national park. So they ended up growing sugarcane, and then they had protected farmland, and they kept the land from being flooded, but there were lots of unintended consequences to the environment. The water became polluted, mainly because they had cattle grazing there, and this polluted water flowed into Lake Okeechobee, which unfortunately was where a lot of the people in Florida got their fresh water. Fish in the water began to die because there were high levels of mercury, phosphorus, and other contaminants. This water flowed into the national park, threatened lots of the vegetation that was there in the Everglades, and it killed birds, it killed other animals. So they put a plan in place to restore the historic flow of water through South Florida, while also trying to make sure that flooding was contained. So to date, few elements of this plan that they put in place have been implemented. Half of the Everglades have been lost to development. And so there's a saying that the Dutch have, that they say God made the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. And Floridians say God made the world in 6 days, but the Army Corps of Engineers has been tinkering with it ever since. So a generation ago, people concerned with the environmental quality used to say, think global, act local. I mean, that's what we said. Oh, here we go. That's the Netherlands. That's what we said when I was younger. Think global, act local. And that phrase used to mean, like, you want to solve the problems in the world, you need to start at home. But now, that phrase has changed to think and act both global and local. So you can't just think on a local level and act just on a local level. You've got to do some bigger things as well. Okay, so let's just summarize really quickly. Geography is most fundamentally a spatial science. So we use maps, we use globes, we use GIS, we use GPS. So it's a spatial science exhibited by an emphasis on mapping. Every place on Earth is in some respects unique, although regions of likeness can be drawn because of the diffusion of people, the way people, objects, and ideas have spread out all over the world, which is really cool. And a substance is merely part of nature until a society has use for it. If its price disregards its cost to the environment, then it's often an unsustainable practice. Okay, guys, that's it for tonight. Hopefully it was a little quicker than usual, and I will see you tomorrow.